On a cold October morning in 1994, 3-year-old Jenny Martinez stood frozen at the edge of Riverside Cemetery in Portland, Oregon. Her tiny finger pointed at a weathered headstone, and the words that came from her mouth would shatter everything. Her parents thought they knew about life, death, and the impossible. "That's where you buried me," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of someone much older, much more experienced with death than any child should ever be. The headstone read, Maria Elena Rodriguez, 1952 to 1989. Beloved wife and mother. Jenny had never been to this cemetery before. She had never heard the name Maria Elena Rodriguez. Yet somehow, this 3-year-old girl knew exactly where to find this specific grave among thousands, and claimed it as her own final resting place. What happened next would become one of the most documented and investigated cases of alleged reincarnation in modern history, challenging everything we think we know about consciousness, memory, and the possibility that death might not be the end of our story. But Jenny's case is just the beginning. Today, we're diving deep into 3 extraordinary real-life cases where children remembered details from previous lives with such accuracy that even the most skeptical investigators were left questioning the very nature of existence itself. These aren't urban legends or internet stories. These are documented cases, investigated by researchers, verified by families, and recorded in scientific journals. Cases where children provided information they could never have known, led families to locations they'd never seen, and revealed secrets that had been buried with the dead. The first case begins with Jenny Martinez, but it doesn't end there. Because what Jenny remembered about her previous life as Maria Elena Rodriguez would lead investigators down a path so dark, so specific, and so verifiable that it would force them to confront a terrifying possibility, that some memories transcend death itself. Jenny's parents, David and Carmen Martinez, first noticed something unusual about their daughter when she was barely 2 years old. She would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, not the typical cries of a toddler having nightmares, but the anguished wails of someone experiencing genuine terror and grief. "Mama, where is my baby? Where is Miguel?" She would sob, calling out for a child named Miguel, while her own mother held her, confused and frightened by her daughter's inexplicable distress. Jenny would describe a house with blue shutters and a red door, a husband named Carlos who worked at the docks, and most disturbing of all, a violent argument that ended with her being pushed down a flight of stairs. She spoke of lying in a hospital bed, unable to move, watching doctors shake their heads while Carlos held her hand and whispered apologies. For months, David and Carmen dismissed these episodes as the overactive imagination of a bright child. But as Jenny grew older, the details became more specific, more consistent, and more disturbing. She knew that Carlos had a scar on his left forearm from a fishing accident when he was 12. She knew that their house was exactly 17 blocks from the waterfront. She knew that Miguel had a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on his right shoulder. Most chilling of all, she knew that after she died, Carlos had buried her favorite necklace with her, a silver chain with a small cross that had belonged to his grandmother. The turning point came when Jenny, now 3 years old, was riding in the car with her parents through a neighborhood she had never visited before. Suddenly, she became agitated, pointing frantically at a house with blue shutters and a red door. "That's my house. That's where I lived with Carlos and Miguel." David, a practical man who worked as an accountant, decided to investigate. He knocked on the door of the house, prepared to apologize for his daughter's confusion and move on with their lives. The man who answered the door was Carlos Rodriguez. And when David explained why he was there, Carlos's face went completely white. Carlos invited the family inside, where Jenny immediately ran to a photograph on the mantelpiece. It showed a woman with dark hair and warm eyes, holding a young boy. who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. "That's me," Jenny said simply, pointing to the woman. "And that's Miguel." Carlos, fighting back tears, confirmed that the woman in the photograph was indeed his late wife, Maria Elena Rodriguez, who had died in 1989 after falling down the stairs during an argument. The boy was their son Miguel, who was now 11 years old and living with his grandmother in another state. But the story was far from over. Carlos, initially skeptical despite the shocking coincidences, decided to test Jenny's claims. He asked her about things that only Maria Elena could have known, intimate details about their life together that had never been shared with anyone else. Jenny knew that Carlos proposed to Maria Elena on the beach at sunset on her 23rd birthday. She knew that Maria Elena had suffered 2 miscarriages before Miguel was born. She knew that Carlos had been having an affair with a woman named Rosa, who worked at the cannery, which had been the cause of their final, fatal argument, most convincing. Of all, Jenny led Carlos to a loose floorboard in what had been their bedroom, underneath which Carlos had hidden love letters from Rosa. Maria Elena had discovered these letters the night she died, which had triggered the argument that ended in her tragic fall. When researchers from the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies arrived to investigate Jenny's case, they were initially prepared to find logical explanations for what seemed like an impossible situation. Dr. Sarah Chun, a psychiatrist specializing in child psychology, conducted extensive interviews with Jenny over a period of 6 months. What she found defied every conventional explanation. Jenny's knowledge of Maria Elena's life extended far beyond what any 3-year-old could have absorbed through overheard conversations or media exposure. She knew the names of Maria Elena's childhood friends, the layout of the house where Maria Elena had grown up, and even the specific details of a car accident Maria Elena had witnessed as a teenager that had never been reported in any newspaper or official record. When Dr. Chun arranged for Jenny to visit Maria Elena's grave, the child approached the headstone with a familiarity that was both touching and deeply unsettling. She placed a small flower on the grave and whispered, "I'm sorry I left you, Miguel. I didn't want to go." But perhaps the most compelling evidence came when Jenny was shown photographs of people from Maria Elena's life, mixed randomly with photographs of strangers. Without hesitation, she identified Maria Elena's parents, her sister Rosa, her best friend Carmen, and even her first boyfriend from high school, a man named Antonio, who had moved to Mexico years before Maria Elena's death. Dr. Chun's investigation concluded that Jenny's case represented compelling evidence for the survival of consciousness beyond physical death, with specific memory transfer that cannot be explained by conventional psychological or neurological models. The case of Jenny Martinez and Maria Elena Rodriguez established the foundation for a new understanding of consciousness and memory. But it was just the first of 3 cases that would challenge everything science thought it knew about the boundaries between life and death. The second case takes us to rural Thailand, where 4-year-old Chennai Chumaleo would lead investigators to uncover a murder that had been covered up for decades, using memories from a life that had ended before he was even born. In 1991, in the small village of Bang Pla, Thailand, young Chennai began speaking about his previous life as a man named Bua Kai Lanak. Unlike Jenny's case, Chennai's memories were not of a peaceful death or family life, but of violence, betrayal, and murder. Chennai told his parents that in his previous life, he had been a teacher who discovered that his wife was having an affair with his best friend. He described confronting them both in a field outside the village, where the confrontation turned violent and resulted in his death. But Chennai didn't just remember the circumstances of his death. He remembered specific details about the location where his body had been buried, details about missing money and property that had never been recovered, and most shocking of all, the names of the people responsible for his murder. Dr. Jürgen Thiel, A German psychologist studying reincarnation cases in Southeast Asia arrived in Bang Pla in 1992 to investigate Chennai's claims. What he found would become one of the most thoroughly documented cases of alleged past life memory in academic literature. Chennai's description of his previous identity as Bua Kai Launak was remarkably consistent and detailed. He knew that Bua Kai had taught at the village school from 1965 to 1969. He knew that Bua Kai owned a red bicycle that he rode to work every day. He knew that Bua Kai had a distinctive scar on his right hand from a childhood accident involving a broken bottle. When Dr. Keel researched the historical records, he found that a teacher named Bua Kai Launak had indeed worked at the village school during those exact years. Bua Kai had disappeared suddenly in 1969, and while villagers assumed he had moved away to find work in Bangkok, no one had heard from him again. The case took a dramatic turn when Chennai led investigators to a specific location in a field about 2 kilometers from the village center. He pointed to a spot near a large tamarind tree and said, "This is where they buried me after they killed me." Local authorities, working with Dr. Keel's research team, excavated the area. 3 feet below the surface, they found human remains, along with remnants of clothing and personal items that matched Chennai's descriptions of what Bua Kai had been wearing the day he disappeared. Forensic analysis of the remains revealed evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with Chennai's claim that Bua Kai had been murdered during a violent confrontation. Carbon dating confirmed that the remains were approximately 25 years old, placing the time of death right around 1969. But the most shocking discovery came when investigators found a metal box buried near the remains. Inside the box were 15,000 baht in cash, equivalent to several months' salary for a village teacher in 1969, along with land ownership documents and a collection of love letters written by Bua Kai's wife to another man. Chennai had specifically told investigators that Bua Kai had discovered his wife's affair when he found her love letters, and that Bua Kai had hidden his savings and important documents in a metal box before confronting his wife and her lover. The contents of the discovered box matched Chennai's description exactly, down to the specific amount of money and the types of documents. The investigation revealed that Bua Kai's wife, Mina, and her lover, Song Chai, had indeed killed Bua Kai during a confrontation in 1969. They had buried his body in the field and had told villagers that Bua Kai had left for Bangkok to start a new life. Mina had eventually married Somchai, and both had lived in the village for another 20 years before dying of natural causes in the late 1980s. What made Chennai's case particularly compelling was not just the accuracy of his memories, but the fact that he possessed knowledge that no living person in the village had access to. The location of Bua Kai's body, the existence of the hidden money and documents, and the specific details of how the murder had been carried out were secrets that had died with the perpetrators. Dr. Keel's investigation, published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration in 1994, concluded that Chennai's case represented extraordinary evidence for the persistence of personal memories across death and rebirth, with verifiable information that could not have been obtained through normal sensory channels. The case became even more remarkable when researchers discovered that Chennai had been born with a distinctive birthmark on his right hand, in exactly the same location where Bua Kai Launak had carried a scar from his childhood accident with the broken bottle. But Chennai's case, as compelling as it was, would be overshadowed by the third and most disturbing case in this investigation, the story of a young boy in Lebanon whose memories of a previous life would uncover not just a murder, but an entire conspiracy of silence that had hidden the truth for more than a generation. In the mountain village of Cornell, Lebanon, 5-year-old Nazi Aldanov began experiencing violent nightmares that left his family terrified and confused. But these weren't ordinary childhood nightmares. Nazi was reliving the final moments of a life that wasn't his own, experiencing the terror and pain of a man who had been brutally murdered decades before Nazi was even born. Dr. Ian Stevenson, the world's leading researcher on reincarnation cases, arrived in Cornell in 1998 to investigate what would become one of the most thoroughly documented and disturbing cases in his 40-year career studying alleged past life memories. Nazi claimed to remember being a man named Fuad Asad Kadij, who had lived in the nearby village of Kfar Mata. But unlike the previous cases we've examined, Nazi's memories focused almost exclusively on the violent circumstances of Fuad's death. Nazi described being approached by two men while working alone in his olive grove one evening in 1943. He remembered being beaten with a metal pipe, shot twice in the chest, and left to die among the olive trees. Most disturbing of all, he remembered lying wounded but still conscious, listening to his killers discuss how they would dispose of his body and divide his property. What made Nazi's case particularly remarkable was the level of specific detail he provided about both the murder and the cover-up that followed. He knew the exact location where Fuad's body had been buried. He knew the names of the two men who had killed him. He knew about a land dispute that had provided the motive for the murder. And he knew about the conspiracy of silence that had protected the killers for more than 50 years. Dr. Stevenson's investigation began with researching the historical records for any evidence of a man named Fuad Asad Kadij, who had lived in Kfar Mata in the 1940s. What he found was both fascinating and troubling. Fuad Asad Kadij had indeed lived in Kfar Mata, where he owned a substantial olive grove and several pieces of valuable land. In 1943, he had disappeared suddenly, and his family had assumed he had emigrated to Brazil, as many Lebanese had done during that period of economic hardship. However, Fuad's disappearance had coincided with a bitter land dispute involving two of his neighbors, brothers named Hassan and Ibrahim Malik, who claimed that Fuad owed them money and had agreed to sell them part of his olive grove. When Fuad disappeared, the brothers had quickly claimed ownership of his land, producing documents that they said proved Fuad had sold them the property before leaving for Brazil. Nazi's memories painted a very different picture of these events. According to the 5-year-old boy, Fuad had never agreed to sell his land to the Malik brothers. Instead, they had murdered him to steal his property and had forged the ownership documents after his death. The case took a dramatic turn when Nazi led Dr. Stevenson and local authorities to a specific location in what had once been Fuad's olive grove. The area had been developed into a residential neighborhood in the 1980s, but Nazi was able to identify the exact spot where he claimed Fuad's body had been buried. "They put me under the ground right here," Nazi said, pointing to a location that was now part of someone's backyard. "They covered me with stones and dirt, and then they planted a fig tree on top so no one would dig there." Excavation of the site revealed human remains buried exactly where Nazi had indicated. The remains showed evidence of severe blunt force trauma to the skull and 2 bullet wounds to the chest, precisely matching Nazi's description of how Fuad had been murdered. Carbon dating confirmed that the remains were approximately 55 years old, consistent with a death in the mid-1940s. Dental records, obtained from a dentist who had treated Fuad in the early 1940s, provided positive identification of the remains as those of Fuad Asad Kadij. But the most shocking discovery came when investigators found personal items buried with the remains, including a distinctive gold watch and a signet ring that had belonged to Fuad's family for generations. Nazi had specifically mentioned both items, describing them in perfect detail despite never having seen them. The investigation also uncovered evidence of the land fraud that had followed Fuad's murder. Handwriting analysis of the property transfer documents revealed that they had indeed been forged, with Fuad's signature copied from other legitimate documents. The Malik brothers had stolen not just Fuad's life, but his entire estate, enriching themselves and their descendants for more than half a century. By the time Dr. Stevenson's investigation was complete, both Hassan and Ibrahim Malek had died, of natural causes, taking their secrets to the grave. However, their sons were still alive and had continued to profit from the land that had been stolen from Fuad's family. The case had profound implications for both the scientific study of consciousness and the concept of justice itself. Here was a murder that had gone undetected and unpunished for more than 50 years, solved only through the memories of a child who claimed to be the reincarnated victim of the crime. Dr. Stevenson's documentation of Nazi's case, published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration in 2001, included sworn statements from more than 30 witnesses, forensic evidence from multiple independent sources, and historical documentation spanning 6 decades. This case presents U.S. with evidence that challenges our fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness, memory, and personal identity, Dr. Stevenson wrote in his conclusion. The specificity and accuracy of Nazi's memories, combined with the physical evidence that corroborates his claims, suggests that some aspect of human consciousness may indeed survive bodily death and retain access to detailed autobiographical memories. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Nazi's case was not the scientific implications of his memories, but the human impact of justice finally being served after more than half a century. When DNA testing confirmed that the remains found in the olive grove belonged to Fuad Asad Kadej, his surviving relatives were finally able to lay him to rest with proper burial rites. The stolen land was returned to Fuad's family, and the truth about his disappearance finally replaced 50 years of speculation and false assumptions. Nazi, meanwhile, gradually stopped having the violent nightmares that had plagued his early childhood. As he grew older, his memories of Fuad's life began to fade, replaced by the normal experiences and memories of his own developing identity. These 3 cases, spanning different cultures, time periods, and circumstances, share common elements that challenge our understanding of consciousness, memory, and the possibility of survival after death. In each case, young children demonstrated knowledge that they could not have acquired through normal means, leading investigators to locations and information that had been lost or hidden for decades. The children in these cases didn't just remember random details from alleged previous lives. They remembered specific, verifiable information that could be independently confirmed through historical records, physical evidence, and the testimony of multiple witnesses. Jenny Martinez knew intimate details about Maria Elena Rodriguez's life and death that only Maria Elena herself could have known. Chanay Chumaleao led investigators to the hidden burial site of Boa Kai Lonak and revealed the location of money and documents that had been missing for 25 years. Nazi al-Danaf provided specific details about Fuad Asad Kadej's murder that enabled investigators to solve a crime that had remained hidden for more than 50 years. In each case, extensive investigation ruled out the possibility that the children had acquired their knowledge through conventional means. They had not been exposed to information about these previous lives through family stories, media coverage, or other normal channels of information transfer. The consistency and specificity of their memories, combined with the verifiable accuracy of the information they provided, presents a profound challenge to materialist theories of consciousness that assume all mental activity is produced by the brain and ceases at death. Dr. Jim Tucker, who succeeded Dr. Ian Stevenson as the director of the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, has studied more than 2,500 similar cases over the past 2 decades. His research has identified common patterns that appear in alleged reincarnation cases worldwide. Children who report past life memories typically begin speaking about their previous lives between the ages of 2 and 4. Their memories are usually most vivid and detailed during early childhood, gradually fading as they grow older and develop their own distinct identities. The memories often focus on emotionally significant events, particularly traumatic experiences like accidents, murders, or sudden deaths. Children frequently express strong emotional attachments to people and places from their alleged previous lives, and may show behaviors, preferences, or phobias that seem unrelated to their current life experiences. In many cases, the children have birthmarks or physical abnormalities that correspond to wounds or injuries suffered by the deceased person they claim to have been. Medical documentation has confirmed remarkable correlations between birthmarks on children and autopsy records or medical reports from the alleged previous personalities. Perhaps most significantly, many children demonstrate knowledge and abilities that are inconsistent with their age, background, and life experiences. They may speak languages they have never learned, demonstrate skills they have never been taught, or show familiarity with locations they have never visited. The scientific investigation of these cases raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness itself. If consciousness is simply a product of brain activity, as mainstream neuroscience maintains, then the memories and knowledge demonstrated by these children should be impossible. The fact that such cases continue to be documented and verified by rigorous scientific investigation suggests that our understanding of consciousness may be fundamentally incomplete. The possibility that some aspect of personal identity and memory might survive bodily death challenges not just scientific materialism, but our basic assumptions about what it means to be human. The cases of Jenny Martinez, Chennai Chumaleao, and Nazi al-Danaf represent just a small fraction of the documented evidence for the survival of consciousness beyond death. Each case, investigated by trained researchers and verified through multiple independent sources, presents compelling evidence that death may not be the end of our story. These children didn't just remember fragments of previous lives. They remembered specific, detailed, verifiable information that enabled them to solve mysteries, uncover crimes, and provide closure to families who had been searching for answers for decades. Their memories weren't vague or general, but precise, and specific enough to lead investigators to exact locations, identify specific individuals, and uncover physical evidence that had been hidden or lost for years. The scientific documentation of these cases, published in peer-reviewed journals and investigated by respected researchers, provides a foundation of evidence that challenges our most basic assumptions about consciousness, memory, and the possibility of life after death. As we continue to explore the mysteries of consciousness and the nature of human identity, cases like these remind us that reality may be far stranger and more complex than we ever imagined. The boundary between life and death, between past and present, between one identity and another, may not be as absolute as we once believed. The whispered words of 3-year-old Jenny Martinez at her own graveside continue to echo through the corridors of scientific inquiry. That's where you buried me. Simple words that opened a doorway to possibilities we're only beginning to understand, and questions we're only beginning to ask. In a world where consciousness remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of science, these cases offer tantalizing glimpses of truths that lie beyond the boundaries of our current understanding. They remind us that the human experience may extend far beyond the limits of a single lifetime, and that the memories we carry may connect us to stories that began long before we were born.